So good evening, and thank you for the welcome. In order to speak about annulments, which is a bad word, and I'll explain why it is a bad word in a few minutes. But in order to speak about divorce and annulments, it is important to understand from the very beginning what marriage is. And I'd like to begin by saying that marriage is a vocation. It is a call given to two people by Almighty God to do something very special in this world. And what is that very special thing? It is to be an image of Christ's love for the church, of God's love for the world. When we look or when we contemplate the love of Christ for the church, what do we see? We see the cross. We see Jesus pouring out his very life for the church. It is, therefore, a love which is totally for the other, a sacrificial love, a love which calls us at times to the cross. Now, it is also important to understand what love is. Love is not the tinkle you feel in your heart when you see somebody that you feel attracted to. That is not love. Love is not the sensation some of you get when you hold somebody's hand whom you like. That might be electricity, but it's not love. Love is a determination of the will. It's a decision to do the best that you can for someone in spite of everything. Love is not emotional attachment, even though emotional attachment is very important, because it can make the loving a little bit more easy when the difficulties come around. And so it is extremely important to keep emotional attachment high. Anytime I'm doing a wedding, I tell the young couple to put aside 1% of their salaries to surprise their spouses. 1% is not much. But you men, you're going home, you know your wife loves anthuriums or roses or something. Stop by the flower shop and buy her a rose. And when she looks at you and says, "It's not my anniversary, it's not my birthday, what do you want? What you did?" You simply say, "Sweetheart, I love you. That is why I brought it for you." Women have to do the same thing. It is things like that that keep emotions high. And those are important, because when you have to do the best that you can do, and that best is very sacrificial, the emotional attachment can help you. So 2 young people come and say they want to get married. And I normally ask the young man first, why do you want to marry her? And he normally says to me, this is the woman who will make me happy. And I turn to her and say, why do you want to marry him? 95% of the time the answer is the same. This is the person who will make me happy. This is the person who will fulfill me, etc. And I look at them and I say immediately, a marriage failed. And they look at me and say, but Father, you're putting goat mouth on us. And I say, no, you put the goat mouth on yourself. You see, nobody can make you happy. We are happy in the measure that we make others happy. And so if someone says to me, you see, Father, this is a young woman I want to spend the rest of my life making happy. And if that young lady says to me, this is the man I want to spend the rest of my life making happy, their marriage will probably last. And marriages fail because people are selfish, they concentrate on themselves, they wait for the other person to make them happy, and they have no concern really about putting the other first and making sure that the other is happy. So of course, after 5 years, 6 years of not being made happy, people say, I can't take this anymore. The grass greener out there, I gone. And so they end up asking for a divorce. And after they get the divorce, of course, if they come from a Catholic family, or if they meet someone who is a Catholic and says, I'm not marrying you unless you get your marriage annulled, then they come to the tribunal and say, I want an annulment. And my answer to them is always, that word annulment is a bad word. And it's a bad word because it gives a wrong impression. If you can annul something, there's something to be annulled. The Catholic Church has no authority to dissolve a valid sacramental marriage. No authority at all. So what does the church do? The church will examine a union, and if it comes to the conclusion that no marriage ever existed, the church will then grant a declaration of nullity. The church will not annul anything. It will just say there was never a marriage here. So people, of course, say, well, You want to tell me that after 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, 4 children, there was never marriage? And at times there was never a marriage. How can you say that? They say to me. And I say to them, but that's an expression you use yourselves. You look at a union and you say that was never a marriage, or they never had a marriage. And why do you say that? Because the qualities you expect to find in a marriage were absent. The church does the exact same thing. It looks at a union and asks itself, were the essentials of a marriage ever here? And at times, the church has to say the essentials were not there. And therefore, the church will grant a declaration of nullity. It will not annul anything, because there was nothing to be annulled in the first place. There was never a marriage. And it is important, therefore, that you understand that the church makes a big difference between a wedding and a marriage. A wedding is a ceremony, civil or religious, during which a marriage is meant to take place. But you can have a wedding without a marriage taking place. How come? The church defines a marriage as a partnership of every aspect of life, entered into for the good of the spouses and for the procreation and education of offspring. 3 essentials: a partnership of every aspect of life, entered into for the good of the spouses and for the procreation and education of offspring. Now, what makes marriage is the intention. That is what makes a marriage, the intention. If you're building a house and you have no intention of finishing the house will never get finished. Not true? Simple. If you're building a partnership of every aspect of life and you have no intention of building that partnership, or if you cannot have that intention for any reason, you have no partnership, therefore there is no marriage. Therefore, when someone comes and says, I want an annulment, I tell them, no, I can't annul anything you have. You may want me to give you a declaration of nullity. If that is what you want, we will examine your marriage to see whether or not the intention to build the partnership of every aspect of life for the mutual good of the spouses and for children was there. If any one of those is missing, there is no marriage. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we give the person who comes to us a questionnaire that goes from birth to the present. Exhaustive. Exhaustive. And I normally tell there are about 18 questions in the questionnaire. Most of them have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Yes. And when people come to me and I say to them, when you bring this back, no yes and no answers. I want at least 10 pages, single space. Yes, there's a little book you have to write. And then we invite the respondent to do the same. And we invite them to present witnesses. Now, the respondent can say, I don't want to take part, do what you want. If that happens, we declare the person absent, we call the witnesses. But we encourage the respondents to take part. When we have all the information, we ask 3 questions. Did they? Could they? And would they? 3 simple questions. Did they intend to build a partnership of every aspect of life? Now, you know people, and I know people who go to the United States and want a green card. Not true? They call a friend of theirs and says, we have to get married because if we don't get married, it will make me leave the country or something. So they go through a wedding ceremony. And they go through the wedding, and then they go to their separate homes. They have no intention of building a partnership of any aspect of life. All they want is the green card. So, of course, they had a wedding but no marriage. Because the intention to build a partnership was absent. All they wanted was the green card. They had no marriage. They had a wedding. And they may have gotten their green card, but they didn't have a marriage. In the same way that people go through a wedding ceremony for a green card, people go through wedding ceremonies for a whole host of reasons. To legitimize a child, for the inheritance, because the girl's father put her out, and when she went to him, his parents said, no man living in this house with a woman unless they're married, so they got married. Whole host of reasons. Unless the motive for that wedding ceremony is the building of that partnership, there is no marriage. It's as simple as that. The second question that we ask is, could they? And that deals with capability. You can't be bound to something you're not capable of doing. Capability is either legal capability or human capability. Legal capability is what the law says. The law says you must be 18 to get married. You're 17, but you lie and say you're 18, you're not married. You cannot be married at 17. You have to be 18. The law says 2 first cousins cannot be married. You get married without a dispensation, you're not married. The law says two first cousins can't be married without a dispensation. Legal capability is what the law says. Human capability has three dimensions. It is physical, intellectual, and psychological. Physical capability, you have to be able to have sexual intercourse or you can't get married. If you're impotent, you can't get married. Impotence can be absolute or relative. Absolute impotence is when you can't have sexual intercourse with anybody. Relative is when you cannot have intercourse with this particular person. Intellectual. You have to know what marriage is about, and you have to know the person you're getting married to, so as to be able to make a prudent judgment as to whether or not with this particular person you can fulfill the obligations of marriage. So anyone who suffers from any intellectual deficiency severe enough to impede the ability to know what marriage is about, can't get married. Anyone who does not know the person they're getting married to, their marriage could also be declared null. That, of course, brings up the whole problem of arranged marriages. And here we enter into cultures. In certain cultures, there are arranged marriages. And I know people whose parents, their marriages were arranged, and have had beautiful marriages. Those people had a determination to make their marriages work. And as they grew to know each other, they recommitted themselves, sometimes subconsciously. And they arrived at a point where their marriages have worked and they're 50, 60 years married. But in our Western world, the Western culture in which we grew up, you know, some people, they meet somebody and in 2 weeks they want to get married. They're certain there's a person they get married to. And they come to the priest 2 months later and say, we want to get married. And some priest stupid enough to marry them. They don't know each other well enough to get married. In our Western world, it's as simple as that. Then you have psychological capability. And that means that the person who's getting married must have the psychological capability to make a prudent decision or to fulfill the obligations inherent in married life. So that any psychological anomaly, and I say anomaly because anomaly is wider than illness. any psychological anomaly severe enough to impede the ability to make a prudent decision or to fulfill the obligations of marriage will render a marriage null. So that all the well-known psychological illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disease, chronic depression, dysthymia, all of those would render a marriage null if they are severe enough to impede the ability to make a prudent decision or to fulfill the obligations of marriage. Anomalies, addictions. Again, severe enough to impede the ability to make the prudent decision or to fulfill the obligations. Alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, computer, liming, all of those would render a marriage null. Yes, liming. I could give you some horror stories. All of those would render marriages null. We did a case sometime back in which, before they got married, this guy was a limer. After they got married, during the honeymoon, he wasn't happy because he couldn't go online. He was in another country, knew nobody. He would come home, take a shower from work, go to the bar. Not drinking, playing cards, all talking. Come home 7:30 for supper. Take a shower, go to bed, get up in the morning, go to work. Repeat the same thing. When his first child was born, his father had to take his wife to the hospital. He was liming. When the child was born, he saw his child 8 hours after the child was born because he was liming. His father took her back home because he was liming. When the second child was born, it repeated itself. Marriage is null. Addiction to liming. So he couldn't fulfill the normal obligations of married life. And then, of course, you have people who are just tremendously immature. You know, there are some people, men and women, they can't see their spouse talk to anybody else. It's noise and licks and scratching out their eyes and all kinds of things. They're too immature to get married. And then the third question is, would they, if circumstances were different, would they have gotten married? If her father wasn't standing behind with a shotgun, I'd never get married. If her mother didn't put out because she was talking to me, and I had an obligation, because it's me her mother put out for, so I felt an obligation to take her in. And my parents say, you can't live here with her unless you're married. So I get married. I was young, a teacher in a Catholic school, and if I was pregnant or not married, I would have lost my job. So I get married. Marriage could probably be declared null. Now, when all that is done, The final question is this marriage null? Affirmative, yes, it's null. Negative means you have not proven that it is null. Negative does not mean it is a valid marriage. All negative says is that you have not proven that it is not. Now, anytime a judge writes an affirmative, or the judge says, I believe this marriage is null, there is an automatic appeal. And the file is taken, our appeal court is in Jamaica, and we send the file to Jamaica, where they don't know the persons involved at all. And they judge the case again. If the appeal court agrees with the judge giving the affirmative, then you will get the declaration of nullity. You never get a declaration of nullity on one judgment. There always have to be two conforming judgments, affirmative judgments, to get a declaration of nullity. So when you hear people talking about is the priest friend and all this kind of thing, they don't know you're in Jamaica. Now, the appeal court in Jamaica might say, no, this marriage is not null, it's a valid marriage. What happens then? We send the file to Rome. The third court, and they judge the case again. If they judge that the case is the marriage is null, you'll get the declaration of nullity because there are two conforming judgments of nullity. If Rome says, no, this marriage is null, case closed. But, remember I said it to you, negative means you have not proven that it is null. You can enter another case using different grounds and added evidence. How long does that take? If it doesn't have to go to Rome, before I was named Archbishop of Port of Spain, it took 18 months about. Since I've been named Archbishop of Port of Spain, I don't have much time to write many judgments, and I haven't got a canonist yet to replace me. So it takes about 2 to 2.5 years now. But we hope to be getting a canonist soon. We hope. So that is how the process is. Now, there are a few things which it is important to understand. Divorce in and of itself does not stop anyone from going to the sacraments. Okay? Divorce in and of itself does not stop anyone from going to the sacraments. Divorce is a civil judgment. It has nothing to do with church. What will stop you is if you are in a permanent sexual relationship or if you have remarried outside of the church. Those are the two things which will stop a divorced person from going to the sacraments. A permanent sexual relationship or marriage outside the church. If none of those applied to you, and you are divorced, go to communion. You need the Lord in your life to help you to live good. So go to communion. There, unfortunately, many priests outside there will give you wrong information. Yes. I remember doing a case once, and this, after I finished it, the judgment was affirmative. It went to Jamaica, came back affirmative, called her in, gave her her decree of nullity. And then I said this to her, well, you can go to communion now. And she said, thanks be to God. And then I said to her, but wait a minute. Have you remarried outside the church? No, Father. Are you in a permanent sexual relationship? No, Father. Why weren't you going into the sacraments? The priest told me I couldn't go because I was divorced. And I said to her, that is wrong. You could have gone. She started crying. And I said, what are you crying for? No, I'm giving you good news. What are you crying for? And she said to me, she said, Father, my daughter was making her first communion and I couldn't go to communion with her. And my son was confirmed and I couldn't go to communion with him. And I said to her, who is the priest? She said, I'm not going to tell you. Another poor woman came to me and said, the priest told her that she couldn't go to communion because she had asked for the divorce. So I said, who is the priest who tell you that? She told me the name. So I went to him and I said, what do you want? The woman to be murdered because it was an extremely abusive relationship. You want the woman to be murdered? But I said, well, you thought wrong. Learn your canon law. The only thing that stops you from communion, if you have got a civil divorce, is a permanent, and here the word I've used, a permanent sexual relationship, or you have got married outside of the church. If it's not a permanent sexual relationship, you have a boyfriend, you're trying to be good, you're trying to live a celibate life, one night for AOB, you slip and have a fall, get up, go to confession and go back to communion. Yes. Just try and don't make those slips a habit. Now, what it's important to understand is this, that when we're dealing with declarations of nullity, the cause of the cause for the failure of the marriage must be pre-wedding. Must be pre-wedding. Or at least the roots must have been pre-wedding. So if you all got married happily, and 10 years after the marriage, your husband picked up, or your wife picked up a mistress or a mister, that is not grounds for declaring your marriage null. That is not grounds for declaring your marriage null. If, however, before you met him, he was promiscuous. During the courtship, he was unfaithful. Within 2 months of the wedding, he's unfaithful again. Then you have grounds. Then you have grounds. Because you're dealing with somebody who, because of bad habits or psychological habits, could not be faithful. So then you have grounds. It may be 15 years after marriage, your spouse has to be put into the psychiatric hospital and has to remain there. That doesn't say you have grounds for a declaration of nullity. If psychological tests or whatever can show that that illness was in germ before the wedding took place, then the marriage can be declared null. So, for instance, bipolar disease. Doctors say to me that bipolar, you're born with that, but it doesn't manifest itself until the late 20s normally. Bipolar disease would be a ground for having a marriage declared null, because it was there in germ from the very beginning. If you got married, there wasn't a problem. 10 years after marriage, your husband lineman with some friends who gamble, and he got addicted to gambling. That is not grounds for a declaration of nullity. If before marriage he was already addicted to gambling, and you got married to him knowing he was addicted to gambling, and the gambling went on, you have grounds. Now, the fact that you may have known that somebody was addicted does not say the marriage is valid. Because it's not whether you knew or not, it's whether the person had the ability to fulfill the obligations of marriage. So whether you knew or not, I mean, if you knew, you were damn stupid. But you never heard an archbishop say damn yet? You have never been close to many archbishops. And the fact of the matter is, excuse me ladies, but many of you are silly. If your boyfriend is abusing you before you get married, what are you marrying him for? What are you marrying him for? Anytime a boyfriend raises his hand to you, put wheels under your heels. And you ladies clap it. Let me tell you, spousal abuse by women is extremely high. The reason you don't hear about it is that no man is going to go and tell his friends but it's true, no man is going to tell his friends that his wife is beating him. But I have had to deal with many cases where the abuse was on the woman's side. She was doing the abusing, not him. So, that, my dear friends, in a nutshell, and in 45 minutes, is what is what marriage, divorce, and annulments, decrees of nullity are about. But the important thing to remember, and I think it is something we don't think enough about, is that marriage is a vocation. It's a call from Almighty God to do something extremely important in the world, which is to mirror that sacrificial love of Christ for the church. That is what a marriage is about. And you see, the reason the church cannot accept divorce is very simply enough. If marriage mirrors the love of Christ for the church, and divorce takes place and we accept it, we are saying that Christ could divorce his church. Christ's love is a faithful love. Christ's love is a faithful love. And spouses are called to mirror that faithful love of Christ for the church. Christ's love is also a very forgiving love. And therefore, spouses have to mirror that forgiving love of Christ for the church. The church has often been unfaithful. Christ continues to love his church. Christ never says, well, all you're getting on bad, I divorce you. When you read the Old Testament, how many times God speaks to the people and says, I will do this and do that and do it, but never does it. God remained faithful to his people right down through the ages. And if we are to mirror that forgiving love, we have to do the same. We have to do the same. So remember that Christ's love is a faithful love, it's a forgiving love, and it's a love which makes us grow. Through Christ's love, we become better people. And so the love of spouses is supposed to make them better people. At times, you go into a home and the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. And you don't want to stay. And at other times, you go into homes and it's a joy to be there. And we can look at couples and say, my, how they have grown. What a nice couple they have become over the years. Their relationship has helped them to grow and become better, nicer people. In the same way that our relationship with Christ makes us become better, nicer people. Spouses have to reflect that love which helps people to grow and become better and nicer people. So that is what you married couples have to work at. Living that threefold love of Christ. The faithful love, the forgiving love, the love which helps us to grow and become better and nicer people. When that happens, there's no divorce and there's no need for declarations of nullity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Grace. Wasn't that beautiful? Praise God. Indeed. A wonderful, wonderful teaching for us tonight and for our sisters and brothers who have joined us on television, internet, and the radio. Thank you, Your Grace, very much. Now, I would like to say that we can ask for a question or two. If somebody has a burning question they would like clarified, something clarified, you can ask His Grace. If there's anybody, are you open to that, Your Grace? Okay, so anybody like to ask a question? Anything?
Good night, Your Grace. Many people, in talking about marriage, divorce, and what you say, the declaration of nullity, they say they want to know what is the position of the children.
Legitimacy and illegitimacy are legal concepts attached to a wedding, not to a marriage. Let me give you an example going back to the green card. And this is a true example. This girl wanted a green card. She contacted a friend. They did the wedding thing, and then she asked him, "What do I owe you? How much I have for you?" And he said, "You don't have to give me anything. Money." And she said to him, "I must give you something." And he looked at her and said, "Sweetheart, you know I love you since I'm small. Just sleep with me one night. That's all I want." Silly girl, she did. A pregnancy resulted. She brought the child to term. That child is legitimate. The child's parents were married when the child was born. Legitimacy and illegitimacy are legal concepts attached to the wedding, not the marriage. And as I tell people often enough, if the divorce didn't do the children anything, the declaration of nullity won't do them anything either. Any other questions?
If a couple decide before they're married that they're not going to have any children,
once they can prove that, the marriages will be declared null. Because remember the definition. It's a partnership of every aspect of life entered into for the good of the spouses and for the procreation and education of offspring. Now, the question which people often ask with that is this: what is the good of the spouses? The good of the spouses is, of course, all the material goods, psychological goods, moral goods. But above all, it is the eternal salvation of the spouse. So that the prime responsibility of spouses is to do their best to ensure that their spouse is saved. That is the prime responsibility of spouses, to do their best to ensure that their spouse is saved. I know many people don't think of that, but it must be awful, to go to heaven and look down and see a spouse shoveling the coal. But you know, I have a sneaky suspicion that if your spouse shoveling coal, you will be shoveling coal with him. Because the spouses become one person. Any other question? Yes?
Your Grace, if someone does exactly what you say, that they divorced, they remarried outside of the church, is there any way that that individual can rectify that situation and return to the church?
Well, that situation can be rectified in two ways. The first, of course, is that the person approach the church to have their marriage declared null. Once the marriage is declared null, the first marriage that is declared null, then they can return to the sacraments. No problem. Of course, they have to marry in church, rectify their second marriage in church, and go to the sacraments. The second option, of course, is that the person may die. If that happens, you just go to confession, rectify your marriage. Spouses, don't give arsenic to the ex-spouse, please. Any other questions? Yeah.
You indicated earlier on that the cause must be pre-wedding. But what about in a case where one of the two individuals develops say a drug habit or alcohol or whatever it is, say 10 years down the road, which is something that there was absolutely no hint of having, that would take place down the road. Now, you hinted a while ago that that is not cause for a declaration of annulment. But we all know that drugs and alcohol can lead to abuse, physical, verbal, all sorts of crazy things happening. Is that, really a reasonable position that can be taken there?
It is a reasonable position because the church has no authority to declare or to dissolve a valid sacramental marriage. Church has no authority to do that. What God has joined, human beings must not divide. The situation in cases like that is this. There are some canonists, and I am one of them, who will say to you, if you can prove to me that that person had an addictive personality from the very beginning, but you'd have to get the psychological test, etc., 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 or the psychological testimony. And if you have a psychologist who can, that is why the evidence we ask for is so exhaustive. And that is why the questions are so exhaustive. Because the questions will reveal whether or not a person had a marked addictive personality. And we all know that if people have addictive personalities, they can grow. but it is not easy to prove. Okay? So don't say, Father Joseph, it is not easy to prove. You have to have a good psychologist or psychiatrist, and you have to have a good canon lawyer. Okay.
In terms of couples that cannot have children, and of course they don't realize this until after getting into the marriage that there's some problem, whether it's on the husband's or the wife's side. I don't know. Does it like come from before marriage?
Okay. The question that is being asked is if sterility is a ground for a declaration of nullity. Sterility is not a ground for a declaration of nullity. But you marry this man, and life seems to be going well. 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. You take the tests, and then the tests prove you will never have a child. And the man packs his bags and leaves. That marriage can probably be declared null. Because what has happened there is that the man did not marry you. He married your fertility. That is what he married. He married fertility. And once you couldn't provide the fertility, he went somewhere else to find someone who could provide the fertility. So he didn't marry you. He married a quality which he thought you had. And when he found out you did not have that quality, he left. But you can't marry a quality, you have to marry a person. So the marriage could probably be declared null.
Your Grace, just a follow-up on the question from the brother here. Suppose after the 10 years, the spouse becomes abusive due to drugs and so on, and is physically abusing, being abusive, and could lead to death, it could lead to... What is the church recommendation or stance on that?
Put wheels under your heels. You can get divorced unless you can prove the marriage was null. You can't remarry in the church. You know, we talk about the sacrificial love of Christ for the church very often. Well, not very often, but often enough. Spouses are called to live that sacrificial love in their flesh. And I'm not saying that they stay and take the licks and get killed, but I'm saying they go, they remain celibate, and offer up their sufferings for the conversion of their husband. And when the husband is converted, they come back home. Maybe.
Thank you.